So first of all, Muriel and James, thank you for this conference. As I already mentioned earlier, for me personally, it's very important to understand, like the overall thematical framework of our discussion, because yeah, based on the previous kind of the first report and everything and the existing discussion, I realized that we found out and we had different perspectives on the same topic, and it's very interesting for me to know like yes, the existing approaches and it's highly interesting discussion. So today I will present to you, actually it's a work in progress, and the material that I collected during the short-term scientific missions to ethnographic open-air museums in Lithuania and Latvia. And during the missions I collected not only the empirical data from museum professionals, but also I worked in archives, and I also collected some descriptions of the guidebooks. But in this specific paper, I will present only the results of the interviews. And before I start, I would like also to ask you for your help, because as I mentioned in my email, this topic is the topic of surveillance is quite new for me, because my major focus is on the museums, cultural heritage, a little bit on censorship. And in this case, I would also ask you, it would be really helpful for me if you could also just give me some suggestions, or maybe during the presentation you will have something in mind that could be helpful in terms of theoretical frameworks or any other existing literature that could be also relevant, because my research is mostly focused on contemporary visitors, contemporary cultural heritage, and contemporary perspectives. So that's kind of my task to you. And I made a presentation that I will probably show to you. Let me see. Just a second.
I might have to facilitate you to do that. Just let me try and do it, and if you can't, I'll.
Because it's presentation in Prezi, and yeah. I can also share a link because it's online. So I don't know how it would be. Just a second. I'm trying to share the screen, but
okay. I think it's set so that you can. Yeah. Yeah, you can according to the settings I have.
I can. Okay, because before there was a screen that I could share, but now I could not see. I could not see the options of the. Okay, let's put it like here and this. And sorry for that. And
it should be at the bottom on the.
Yeah. I see. Yes. Yes. So yes. Do you see the screen?
Yes.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah.
Perfect. Yes. Okay. Great. That's also something new for me, because I mean in Prezi I've never shared. I shared PowerPoint, but not Prezi. Okay. So then, yes, let's start. And so based on the topic, I think that if how to connect this my topic and my interest to the scope of the working group, I think that for me personally it would be very interesting to see how culture of surveillance that was actually manipulated and manifested through censorship practices, through ideological control, frames and shapes the folk culture that actually appeared to be under surveillance. And in this case, for me, it would be interesting to see and to scrutinize the dynamics between these two concepts. So on one hand, there was ideological surveillance, but on the other hand, based on the data and materials that I collected, also there was a certain kind of professional resistance to the existing measures, control, and surveillance. So, okay. Yes. And as an introduction, so ethnographic open-air museums in general, my interest in ethnographic open-air museums is grounded in my doctoral thesis research, and the focus is placed on the contemporary visitors and communication and different genres of interactions But once again, I'm very interested in the historical dimension of this institution, because I found out that they actually performed many interesting roles during the socialism. And for me personally, it would be also very interesting to see this kind of the historical transformation and transition of this institution and the existing genders. So in this case, in line with this Soviet kind of internationalism, order, ethnographic or folk art culture and folk culture was extensively used for ideological purposes. And on one hand, it was very good for the development of cultural institutions, because the whole network of folk art institutions and museums was developed. On the other hand, once again, given this kind of the specificity of the socialism and ideological agenda, ethnographic open-air museums and other cultural institutions were under surveillance from the regime, and they have to balance between these two ideologies while presenting the national culture and nationalistic ideas on one hand, and on the other hand, coping with the overall general requirements. So in this case, my focus and the focus of this study is placed specifically on the ethnographic open-air museums, and I will use this abbreviation as institutionalized agents of folk culture. And because, as I mentioned before, folk culture was very important for the development of this kind of concept of Homo Sovieticus, and it was an important tool for the development and the spread of the ideas. So the goal and the research questions, so this paper aims to unveil the complexities of the relationship between ideological surveillance and expressions of professional resistance in ethnographic open-air museums in Estonia and Latvia during socialism. Later on, the plan is also to include Lithuania, because I believe that the practices of surveillance will be the same, but given the fact that the museum is focused on a little bit different perspective in terms of religion, it would be also interesting to see how they cope and balance between these two kind of dimensions. So I intend to understand this process by focusing on its dialectical character and how museum professionals experience the ideological surveillance in their daily practices, and what strategies and tactics do they employ to implement a double standard, to balance between ideologies. So, and I posit that ideological surveillance and professional nonconformity are informed by the complex dynamics between them, which can be only scrutinized in mutually constructed interaction, situated in particular historical, cultural, and professional context. And that's why it is also important for me in this paper. I mean, I will not focus a lot on this, but also I think that it would be also relevant to present here the historical context of the Baltic states, and also professional context of ethnographic open-air museums, because as cultural institutions, they're a little bit different from historical or room science museums. And that's why I think that this kind of the peculiarities of both historical and cultural and professional context could kind of generate very interesting observations and results. So in line with this goal, my main two research questions are: how did ideological surveillance was executed on different professional and institutional levels, and what strategies did museum professionals employ to resist? So right now, I was focused mostly on the first question, so I have to also think a little bit more about the strategies. I mean, I already have some insights from the data, but I will not present the strategies during this presentation. And as you can see here, so I approach it as, you know, like the practices of ideological surveillance on one hand, and the institutional conformity on the other hand, and how, and specifically, I will trace it through these professional practices, and showcasing how collection, display, interpretation, and administration of museum was shaped and developed. And so the methods I already mentioned a little bit earlier. So I used the existing literature, and it was really helpful for me, the recent handbook the recent Handbook of Courage project that is actually focused on the collections. The scope of my study is focused on museum practices, so it's a little bit different, but given the fact that there are also several chapters about the Baltic states, historical context, and as well as the implications of folk and folk culture. So some chapters were really helpful for me. And so it was based on, the study was based on the literature review. But unfortunately, I didn't find anything about the specificity of museological practices or, you know, the museum works during the socialism and this kind of dynamics between this ideological surveillance and professional practices. So in this case, if you know, please send me, give me some kind of hints or advice about the literature. And also in-depth interviews with museum professionals. And later, at the end of this presentation, probably, I hope I will have time. Yes. So I will also share with you some kind of observation, because for me it was very interesting to see how actually the conversation about surveillance and professional resistance shaped the self-censorship of my respondents, because they were really, I would say, some of them were very kind of sensitive, and for them, despite of the fact that we, you know, like we discussed the history that, or the professional practices that were like 50 years ago, or sometimes like, so some of them, they were really concerned about these topics, and they didn't really want to, not really, you know, like to tell some kind of things that probably could be misinterpreted by me, or, you know, so it was, I realized that it was a sensitive topic for them, despite of the fact that, you know, like, of course I didn't try to kind of question them or put them into this kind of unpleasant situation. So materials. I conducted interviews with 14 museum professionals, and in the text that I sent, I also mentioned their kind of professional specialization and their position in the museum, because it was also very interesting to see how their professional position, and that was also one of the goals of the paper, to see how the surveillance was implemented on different levels. And in this case, so I conducted 8 interviews in Estonia and 6 interviews in Latvia. And most of those, my respondents, they were already retired. And for many of them, it was, I also talked to, you know, museum administration and directors. And in general, the attitude to this study was very interesting, because they told me that it would be also important for the historiography of the museums, because no one has conducted any study about the kind of the development or the professional practices of the museums during the socialism. So that in general, they were very supportive, and they really tried to help me and tried to give me all this, the access to the archival records and materials. So in general, it was a very interesting experience. So case studies, I will briefly just introduce you both museums. I mean, I hope you're familiar with what is ethnographic museum is and what is, but the specificity of these museums is that Latvian ethnographic open-air museums was actually established before the Soviet Union. And this was very interesting because in 1955, actually the museum and the concept of museum was completely changed. And it was also used for this kind of, for the purposes to develop pan-Soviet open-air museum that displayed not only Latvian collections, but also houses from all over the Soviet Union. And that was for maybe for 3 years, but after that they decided that the focus will be placed on Latvian only and on Latvian ethnographic collections. And of course, like the museum, despite these buildings and different wooden vernacular examples of wooden vernacular architecture, also displays churches, public institutions like schools, shops, and also the houses of peasants under this kind of class society. And the second case is Estonian Open Air Museum. It is also interesting in terms of this kind of Soviet museology, because this was the first museum that was opened, the first open air museum that was opened during the Soviet time. And it served as a prototype and the model for other museums that were opened later, like in Lithuania, in Belarus, in Ukraine, so on and so forth. And also what is interesting about this museum is that besides the fact that like they experienced the ideological surveillance, also the museum is located, and it was former border area, border zone. So the museum was also, kind of the territory of the museum was also surveilled by custom controls. And there were certain restrictions in terms of visitor behavior and taking pictures and, you know, in general, the way how the guided tour was organized. And in this case, it was also kind of mentioned then by my respondents in the data. So, preliminary results. In general, when it comes to the practices that I developed here or presented here, on the first level, it was collection and all the practices that are related to the objects. And the overall kind of trend was that collect whatever you like, but for God's sake, people should not see it. And in general, the respondents mentioned that it was a golden age of ethnography and ethnographic museum. Because ethnographic expeditions were generously supported by the state. And of course, they were allowed, you know, like to collect any objects that they would like to have in the museum, including religious objects and those objects that have never been displayed. And what else? Yes, and also in terms of collection practices, so my respondents mentioned that there was no strict surveillance, so there was a plan, like museum plan for the strategic development, and they tried to kind of comply with the ethnographic areas and historical division of the country, and try to collect both architectural and archaeological collection, ethnographic collections according to this description. So in this case, I would say that in terms of collection practices, it was kind of, the surveillance was not executed openly. So when it comes to display, and here we have its kind of a liminal stage between the object-centered practices and visitor-centered practices, because display, it's more about the concept and it's more about the ideology of the institution. So in this case, it is very interesting the way how, for example, religious objects were interpreted or presented. For example, like in case of, because it was initially the Museum of Architecture and Rural Lifestyle, so when it comes to interpretation and display, so the focus was placed on architectural and aesthetic value of the objects. And the spiritual and religious comments were not presented, or, I mean, this information could be provided if a guide or the person who is specifically interested in this aspect asked additionally. But it was not on display, so it was kind of hidden. And here also is, in case of Estonian Open Air Museum, what is very interesting, because as I mentioned, it was a border control and kind of marine belt area. And in this case, it was forbidden to display boats on the coastline, because in general in Estonia, as you probably know, like Estonians were not allowed to have access to the Baltic Sea. And that's why it was very interesting, because it was a problem for the museum. They couldn't really display the island regions where fishing was the important and primordial trade. And that's why they actually cross-cut the boats to display it in the museum. So yes, and in this case, I mean, when it comes to this display kind of practices, then we could see this ideological control, even though that they also try to maneuver and try to play around the established kind of regulations and rules. And the second level, the most interesting, is interpretation, because the focus was placed also on this kind of visitors and the practices that deals with the sharing and framing knowledge about the past and about these collections. So, and here I got the interviews from two guides and the director of the museum. They mentioned that, for example, the guided tours were surveilled by KGB agents, and both guides from both museums, from Estonian Open Air museums and from Latvian Open Air museums, repeatedly mentioned during the interviews that they experienced this surveillance. However, the surveillance was practiced mostly when they were guided foreign groups. And there was also interesting situation, like one of the guides was actually fired because she mixed up the two very important kind of concepts. So a red corner, you know, krasny ugel, with and it's this is, you can see it on the left picture. So it's important, the corner with the icons and the bottom part of any house, and with Lenin's corner, with krasny uголок. So when it comes to this krasny uголок and Soviet exposition, of course, ethnographic open air museums were lucky, and I also got this information repeatedly from the interviews that since the focus was placed on this kind of pre-industrial wooden architecture, they could escape the Soviet period of time in their collection. And that's why, I mean, they didn't have to, the ideology was not that so strong in those museums. And what is also interesting is that in case of Estonian Open Air Museum, the museum serves as the landmark of the country, and all the delegations foreign delegations were actually invited to the museum, but the tours for those delegations were guided by the heads of Communist Party. And museum guides in this case were just service personnel, so they couldn't intervene and they couldn't really participate in these guided tours. And what is also interesting is that, yes, given the fact that one of also the kind of agenda of the museum was to show this disadvantaged past of pre-industrial time. So in Estonian case, they had to, because the focus is placed on this big houses, Riga, and it was very difficult for the guides to explain why Estonians used to live in such a big houses before the Soviet time. And in this case, they had to kind of provide an additional stories or invent their own interpretations why the houses were so big and why actually people were living in these conditions, and they had to kind of demonstrate the advances of the regime. So administration, I didn't put it on the slide, but because I actually conducted only one interview with the founder of Estonian Open Air Museum, but on his level and based from his interview, he was constantly under control from the state, and he was constantly questioned by the agents. And when he is architect from the professionally, but he was also like the founding father of the museum. And in terms of his kind of professional life and everything, he was threatened like physically many times during his activities during the establishment of this museum. And like very preliminary conclusions are that I could, based on this practices, on the analysis of the interviews, I could see that the ideological surveillance in museum practices was kind of manifested and implemented with different with different kind of extent on different layers and levels. For example, in terms of collection, there was almost no surveillance. And in this case, ethnographers had freedom of what to collect and what to bring to the museum to document. And in this case, that provides also very important opportunity for them to collect the objects or the items that were kind of initially considered as not appropriate or prohibited. When it comes to display, the display practices were surveilled, and because it was important to on this level, it was important to kind of to translate and to communicate the ideas of socialism. And but the strongest control was implemented on the interpretation and administration levels, because both guides and museum administration, they kind of were surveilled constantly, and especially the surveillance was, and they had to kind of invent different strategies how to overcome and how to balance between this, the promotion and of the national ideas and the ideology. And yes, as I mentioned also, it was very interesting to see the self-censorship practices and actually the attitude of the museum staff to the interview. And those museum workers who were actually employed at both museums since the very beginning, maybe, I don't know, it's, you know, like it's the imprint of the Soviet regime or whatsoever. They were very concerned, and they asked me to send this list of the questions before the interview. And they really approached this interview as very important, specific, and serious kind of task for them. While those museum professionals who were employed during the later period of Soviet time, they were more open in terms of sharing their stories, telling some kind of situations that demonstrate the way how they protest and how this kind of professional kind of resistance was operated and organized by them. So I will probably also add it at the end of the article of the paper, because I think it's also very interesting observation in terms of how this the discussion about surveillance and censorship could actually impose certain self-censorship on the respondents and their behavior. So thank you very much. And this is the picture from the Latvian Open Air Museum. And this is the picture from the Baltica movement. And it was also very important, and it's an interesting sign, because this movement was kind of, it started the process of liberation in the specifically in Latvia. It was very important for the national independence. And in this case, part of the protests and part of the Baltica delegation actually came to Open Air Museum that is located in the suburbs of Riga, because for them it was an important place to celebrate it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Who's chairing? James, are you chairing?
I can chair, that's fine, yeah. Yeah, thank you very much, Nadzeya. So the floor is open for questions. We have about 15 minutes for questions. I have a question if no one else has one.
I will have one too.
Yeah. So I'll kick off if that's okay. So I mean, the very final point there you made about the symbolic significance of the museum for the kind of liberation movement and Baltica might be a nice way to frame the article, because otherwise, well, framing it that way will help the reader of the article to understand why the site might be symbolically significant to be surveilled, and the fact that it was also on the border. It's a kind of, you know, this kind of territorial questions on the kind of fringe of the Soviet, sensitive kind of western fringe of the Soviet Union, the sea, and so on, mean that, you know, actually it's quite understandable why it might be heavily surveilled. I think the problem you'll have writing convincing account of how that surveillance unfolded, is, which might be a little bit out of sync with the other presentations, is, you know, everybody else is pretty much working on historical archival sources.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned there that the director of the museum was under surveillance and had been threatened. And I just wonder, is it at all possible to see his surveillance file?
I didn't work in the archive. I mean, I just worked also only in the museum archive, and of course, there were nothing about kind of him in the museum archive. But probably.
Yeah, this was the Estonian museum, because maybe Aigi can offer some advice on if it's even possible in the next few months just to see that one file, because it might be interesting. And the only thing, I mean, I don't know much about the Baltic republics and the way the KGB operated and surveillance. The only thing I know is about, you know, this very, very strong emphasis on prophylactica. So the threatening, and this kind of the very brief mention you made there that he was threatened lots of times just reminded me of a couple of articles I read about Lithuania, that the threats were you know, a kind of major aspect of the way that control was maintained in the Baltic republics. So maybe that's just, I'm just throwing something out there, if it's even possible to get sight of the museum director's surveillance file or interrogation file.
Mm-hmm.
It would add a whole new dimension to what you're saying, you know.
Yeah. Thank you.
Muriel, did you have some questions?
Yeah, my questions are very stupid. Not at all the highbrow questions type James. So I have a series of very tiny things. I still don't understand the Betwixt word in the title.
Yes.
Then
between and betwixt, yes.
Yeah. Then about open air museums in Baltic countries, I was wondering about the climate. How long were they open in the year? I mean, were they open throughout winter as well? So I'd be curious about that.
No, I mean, it depends on the museum. And there's also very interesting kind of transformation, because during the Soviet time, they were closed during the winter, and they were also only open for special occasions, like if they would like to show some kind of traditional celebration whatsoever. And so nowadays, both museums are open during the winter time, but the houses are closed. So during the winter time, they mostly serve as, you know, parks for the citizens of Riga and Tallinn just to stroll, work there.
Yeah.
And yes, so, but that's very common. That's quite common everywhere.
Okay. Then just a side remark, I really like the notion of professional resistance. Yeah, I would love to hear more about that when you continue your research. Then I was, about literature about museum practices. I don't know if there's so much about communism, but I think it's very useful to read generally about museum practices, not only in the communist world. I was just writing an article about the Czech Museum of Communism today, and I was kind of trying to develop my methodology about museum curatorial practices. And I was reading about the most I learned from a museum at the seaside in Wales, and, you know, things that have nothing to do, but museum practices and curatorial practices are interesting everywhere, and you will always learn a lot, even if it's not in your country, and even if it's a different regime.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was the first image you showed, I was really surprised that it's obviously at the seaside, and I was remembering that the seaside was closed in Estonia. So I was like, why do a museum right at the seaside? And I was wondering, can it be that it was a good way to attract the people to come, because that would be the best way to get close to the sea? I mean, just to see, to enjoy the sea that they didn't have any access to it. I was like, maybe it's done on purpose.
No, I mean, in Estonia, it's not. It's an issue in Lithuania because there is very and in Latvia, relatively small coastline area. But in Estonia, it's not an issue, and that also why it was such a big trauma for Estonians, because it was coastline everywhere, all over the country. But they had limited access to it, and even like nowadays. Like when I talk to people, they still, I mean, I still feel this kind of trauma that they have this kind of limited access. And I think that like the place for the site was chosen because based on the landscape, because it should be diverse to kind of represent the landscape of the whole country. So that's why this specific area was selected. And because Estonia also has this coastline, it should be a kind of, the landscape with this coastline should be included in the museum. So that's why it was, I think it was located specifically in that area.
Mm. And then a more general question, what was, how could I say, the ideological function of such a museum in the Soviet system?
The ideological function was, first of all, to demonstrate, because the idea was kind of to spread the idea about to spread the idea about the workers. And in this case, those museums, because they were initially kind of focused on the peasant culture, it was a smooth, they provide a smooth transfer from this peasantry to the workers class. And that's why they were highly employed for this ideological purposes. And moreover, because of industrialization and everything, it was also kind of a good showcase to demonstrate that, okay, this is how people used to live before the Soviet regime. And now with industrialization, we had the advantages of the, of the progress. And that was also one of the purposes, to demonstrate this kind of disadvantaged past. But of course, in the Baltic states, they do not want to show this history through this as a kind of disadvantaged past, despite the fact that, of course, the living conditions were not that good. And of course, I mean, people lived poorly and so on and so forth. And that was the kind of the cornerstone of this exposition and this kind of debate between ideologies.
And when did they start these museums?
When?
Yeah.
The first one started in Riga. It was opened initially in 1924, but it was transformed and totally kind of redesigned in 1955. And it was also connected to this broader kind of communist regime and transformation in Latvian Communist Party, because they practice in Latvia national communism, where the local party members had they received the authority from Moscow to kind of to develop their own cultural policy. And in this case, of course, those museums, both in Estonia I didn't know, I'm not sure, I have to ask also Agi. But at least in Latvia, I know for sure that they were somehow protected by the local Communist Party members. So that despite the fact that, of course, they had to report to Moscow about the, the situation and the kind of the activities of the museum, but in many cases, the respondents mentioned that the local Communist Party was loyal to the museum, because for the Communist Party, it was also a kind of a landmark and a good destination where they could show, like the achievements of the Soviet regime in terms of culture and the development of folk ideas and folk art, because that was also part of the kind of the main ideology, the focus.
And so Betwixt?
Betwixt, but it's a fixed phrase. I mean, betwixt and betweens, meaning that it's liminal. It's not cultural opposition, but it is in between. So that's the idea.
That's English. That's not.
Yes, that's English. Yes.
All right. I thought it was Latvian or something, or Estonian.
Yeah.
Between and between. Okay, my mistake.
Between, yeah.
Thank you for enlightening me on this.
Maybe I add also some comments, and thank you, Nadia, for the.
Yes.
It's really interesting to compare the different cases, and it would be good if you can also add the Lithuanian case because there is similarities, differences, so on. But if you want to focus to the manipulation, the different kind of manipulation, then to my mind, it's not enough only focus the perspective of museum administration or focus only the interviews, because there is also official side, and I'm absolutely sure that several people interviewed by you are not they don't know about some kind of restrictions and limits and so on. So I think that for about these regulations and prescriptions, you had to use archival material, and I checked during your paper that, of course, the main material in the cultural ministry about the museum, Estonian museum, and I remember that maybe I used several years ago the file about this discussion about the location of Estonian museum, especially as it was in border area. And to my mind, there is a lot of material and discussion and discussion about this this question. So my main suggestion is please use please use archival materials also.
Yeah, okay, thank you. But you know, I mean, now I don't know when when I will be able to come to Estonia from Sweden. So it's almost, I don't know.
Maybe some material is digitalized.
Yeah, I will check it. Yes.
Estonia, it's
yeah, I know. I know.
Digitalized.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Do we have any more questions?
I was thinking maybe Gabriella wrote a lot about museums.
Sorry?
Yeah. Gabriella wrote a lot about museums too.
Yes,
right?
She has done. Yeah, and she would be, and especially to do with the attitudes of people working in the museum. Do you know Gabriela Nicolescu? Have you met
Yeah,
her?
I know. Yes, I'm in touch with her. Yeah.
Yeah, so some of her work might be useful. In fact, her PhD thesis probably touches on a lot of these issues around, especially the transition and the cadres that were in the museum during communism and different conceptions of the role of the museum.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So if we don't have any more questions, shall we move on to the next paper, Muriel?
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Nadia.